It was the summer of 1995. 13 years old Thad Phillips had fallen asleep in his living room watching a movie. Suddenly, he awoke to the feeling of someone lifting him up and carrying him away. Initially, he thought maybe it was his dad, bringing him upstairs to bed. But it wasn't. The person holding him was an older teen boy named Joe Clark. Joe carried Thad outside of his home and asked him to follow him to help fix his broken down car. Still half asleep, Thad agreed, following Joe all the way to the rundown broken home. He followed Joe into the home, not realizing he was about to endure the most terrifying, painful 43 hours of his life. The teenage boy that Thad thought could be a friend turned into his worst nightmare. Joe laughed at the sound of bone breaking. He attacked Thad, twisting and turning his ankles until his bones shattered and splintered, making it nearly impossible for the young boy to get away. After 2 days of being tortured miraculously, Thad was able to escape with his life. He was lucky because, as it turned out, he wasn't the only victim of Joe Clark, but he was the only one to live. This is the story of Thad Phillips, the one lone survivor of the Bone Breaker killer. In the summer of 1995, 13 years old Thaddeus "Thad" Phillips was new to the town of Baraboo, Wisconsin. He and his family had just moved into their new home and Thad had started at a new school. They lived in a middle-class neighborhood and were just getting familiar with the area. They didn't really know anyone and he was still making friends. On July 29, 1995, the Phillips family went out for dinner and then returned home to enjoy a movie in the living room. Later in the evening, Thad's parents decided to head to bed, but he and his sister stayed up to watch some TV. Thad ended up falling asleep in the living room, which I have got to say is my absolute favorite way to sleep. A few hours after dozing up, Thad woke up to someone picking him up off the couch and carrying him away. He was still half asleep and at first thought it was must be his father carrying him up to the bed. Again, another one of my most favorite things as a kid. As he rubbed his eyes awake and looked up at the person holding him, he realized that he didn't know this person. It was an older looking teenage boy. He didn't recognize him, but later it would be revealed that this boy was Joe Clark, a 17 years old older kid who lived in the same neighborhood. Joe carried Thad outside of his home and then put him down. He seemed friendly enough and asked Thad if he could follow him to his car because he was having some trouble getting it started. Thad was still half asleep and completely disoriented. He didn't really think twice about it and followed Joe down the street. The two boys walked about half a mile from where the Phillips lived and stopped when they arrived at what looked like a rundown, derelict home. Joe kind of switched gears. He dropped the topic of the broken down car and told Thad to follow him inside. He had planned to throw a party soon and was going to invite several other boys from school. Thad recognized the names, so even though he was slightly confused as to what was going on, he followed him inside, figuring this would be his opportunity to meet some new people from school and make some new friends. At this point, he wasn't fearful, but he should have been. The home was an absolute wreck. It was in shambles. Everything was dirty. There were clothes all over the place, moldy dishes and old food. From everything that I've read, I cannot quite figure out where Joe's parents were. But it's clear they were either away doing their own thing for an extended period or just completely neglectful. Probably both. Walking through this wreck of a house, Thad began to get apprehensive, but Joe maintained a friendly disposition. So when Joe asked him if he wanted to go up to his room to check out some of the model cars he collected, Thad said yes. They sat on the bed beside one another looking at these cars, when suddenly Joe's eyes went dark. He pushed Thad down onto the soiled bed and grabbed his right ankle. He began to twist the ankle against its natural position until the bones shattered and splintered. Have you ever seen these gymnastic videos where the gymnast lands on their legs the wrong way and they just snap and break? It's horrifying. But Joe loved the sound of snapping bones. Thad would have been in agonizing pain, confused and shouting for him to stop. Unfortunately, Joe was much larger than Thad, but in that moment he knew he had to try to get the hell out of here. So he jumped off the bed and tried to get away, hobbling down the stairs with a shattered ankle. He was able to get all the way past the living room, with Joe right behind him. As he reached the kitchen, Joe grabbed him from behind and dragged him onto the couch in the living room, where he continued to brutalize him. Joe looked infuriated that Thad had even attempted to escape him, and he took his anger out on Thad's right leg. He pushed the leg up towards Thad's head, putting his entire weight on the leg until he heard the thigh snap. That seemed to satisfy Joe, because just as quickly as he had become enraged, he returned to a friendly disposition. It was terrifying how quickly he could change back and forth from a monster to a friend. When Joe had calmed down, Thad asked him why he was doing this to him, and Joe casually responded that he enjoyed the sound of bones breaking. It was as simple as that. Then he put on the television and they began to watch TV. Joe chatted with Thad as if nothing had happened, and Thad thought this could be his opportunity to get help. He asked Joe if he could use the phone to call his parents. No doubt they were worried about him. To his surprise, Joe said yes and handed him the phone. As Thad frantically began to dial his number, he realized there was no dial tone. He looked up at Joe and saw he was smiling. He had cut the phone cord. He was never going to allow Thad to get help. He just enjoyed watching him lose all hope. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, Joe became enraged once again. He picked Thad up and carried him upstairs to his room, threw him back on the bed where he now focused on his left leg. He began to twist his left ankle until it shattered. This time, Thad tried defending himself by punching him in the back, but he told him if he didn't stop fighting, he would break his back. So Thad laid there and endured the pain. At this point, the adrenaline was flowing through Thad's veins, and his only saving grace was his body was going into shock, meaning he could hear the breaking and popping of his bones, but he couldn't feel it happen. But going into shock means that your body recognizes your life is in a very serious danger, and it's allowing you a bit of grace to help you survive what is happening to you. Now, as much as Joe enjoyed breaking bones, he also liked to fix them, so that he could break them once again. Over the course of the next evening, he would alternate between breaking Thad's bones and creating makeshift bandages and a sling to try to heal his injuries. He would wrap Thad's legs in bandages made of socks and then use a brace to keep the legs stable and straight. At times, he would even try to get Thad to walk with this makeshift casting system. At times, the pain was unbearable, but Thad refused to give Joe the satisfaction of seeing him cry. Meanwhile, Thad's parents woke up to find their son missing. This was highly unusual because they had just moved to the area. Thad wasn't particularly familiar with the neighborhood and hadn't really made any friends yet. There weren't any sign that something nefarious had happened, like signs of a struggle. The only thing that seemed kind of Odd was that the kitchen light had been left on when they always turned it off before bed. They got into their cars, driving around, searching the town. They got into their cars, driving around, searching the town for their son, completely unaware that he was being held in a home only half a mile away from where they lived. They tried not to panic. The fair was in the town that weekend. Maybe he had gone to check it out, but they searched the fairgrounds and there were no sign of him. If only they had decided to go door to door to their neighbors, they may have found him. But hindsight is 20/20. Eventually, when they had exhausted all avenues, they filed a missing person report with the police. Local police told them they had been on the lookout for him, but other than that, there wasn't much they could do. There weren't any signs that anything criminal had happened. He was a 13 years old boy who they assumed he had run off with some new friends and would eventually show up later. Back at Joe's house, Thad was lying on the bed with swollen broken ankles and thighs. At times, Joe would move to the other parts of his house and he would hear Joe talking to someone, but couldn't hear anyone talking back. Thad assumed that there must be a working phone located somewhere in the house and he knew he had to find it. That evening, he planned to try to escape once more. He heard Joe leaving his house, get in his car and drive away, so this was his chance. He knew it might be his only chance. Joe had assumed he had done enough damages to Thad's leg. It would likely be impossible for him to get up and escape, but he was wrong. Thad flung himself off the bed and dragged his body and heavy broken legs towards the stairs. He knew he wouldn't be able to walk down the stairs because his legs were absolutely shattered and swollen beyond recognition, so he threw himself down the stairs. He hit the landing so hard that it knocked him out for a few moments. He was weak from both his injuries and from the lack of food and water that he had been given to him throughout this whole ordeal. When he came to, he attempted to crawl through the living room and into the kitchen, where he once again passed out. Then he heard the front door open and Joe and a girl walked in. They sat on the couch in the living room, talking, laughing, kissing, completely unaware that Thad was in the kitchen lying on the floor, silent and still. Eventually the girl left and Joe walked into the kitchen. He was shocked to find Thad lying on the floor. Picked He once again picked Thad up, carried him back up the stairs, where he punished him for trying to escape by holding a pillow over his face. He punched him, kicked him, jumped on his chest, and once again twisted his ankles, compounding his older injuries. Then he carried Thad back down the stairs so they could watch TV together. Because that's completely normal. And once again, I have to ask, where the hell are Joe's parents this whole time? Not where they should be, keeping an eye on their sadistic son? Thad asked Joe if he had ever done this to anyone else, and he said he had twice. One of the names he gave was some kid named Chris Steiner. Thad didn't know who Chris was, but he was shocked to hear he had gotten away with it once before. They both passed out on the couch, and I couldn't imagine the thoughts that might have been running through Thad's heads. And I can't imagine the thoughts that must have been running through Thad's head. By the following morning, Thad had been missing for nearly 2 days. How long was this torture going to continue? Joe lifted him up off the couch and carried him back upstairs. He had plans to go to a party that day, so he continued to twist Thad's already mangled legs to absolutely ensure he couldn't escape this time while he was away. When he was done, for good measure, he placed Thad's into his closet and locked the door. He wasn't taking any more chances of Thad's escaping. Then Joe got into his car and left. Thad had already tried and failed to escape 3 times. His body was failing him. He had endured over 40 hours of the most horrific abuse. His legs were completely shattered. They were purple, blue, swollen, mangled, and didn't look human anymore. He felt like it was now or never. If he wanted to ever see his family again, this would be his best and last chance to escape. Ted took a look around the closet to find something he could use to break down the door. There wasn't much in the musty, dirty closet, but he did find an old guitar. He grabbed it, and with every ounce of energy he had left in his body, he slammed it down on the closet door until it gave away and opened. Thad dragged himself out of the bedroom, over the stairs, and once again threw himself down. The only way he was able to get down then. He crawled. Thad dragged himself out of the bedroom, over the stairs, and once again threw himself down. The only way he was able to get down them. He crawled through the living room into the kitchen where there was a corded phone on the wall. He was able to grab the phone cord and pull the receiver down. Thank God it had a dial pad on it. When he called 911, the operator who answered thought it was a joke at first because of how calm Thad was. He told them his name and that he was being held at Joe Clark's home. The local police were familiar with Joe. They had run-ins with him in the past, so they knew exactly where to go. The police arrived at the home quickly and found Thad lying on the kitchen floor. They were shocked to see the condition of his body. His feet were nearly completely turned around and his legs were twisted back in an unnatural position. Thad was put into an ambulance and sent to the hospital. He was lucky to be alive because the doctors told him he was just hours away from dying. Thad had been holding for about 43 hours of pure torture. He sustained severe fractures to both of his legs and needed several surgeries over the years. It was a miracle that he didn't have further damage, though he would permanently walk with a limp. After getting out of the surgery, Thad was able to tell the police about the other 2 people Joe had admitted to hurting. He couldn't remember the name of the first kid, but the second was Chris S. He wasn't sure of the last name, but he remembered it started with an S. That kid would turn out to be the 14 years old Chris Steiner, but we'll go into that in a minute. The police would find and arrest Joe Clark while he was still at the party. He seemed completely unfazed. The first words out of his mouth were, "Oh, he's still alive?" They brought him into the police station while they searched his home, where they found a list of 29 names on 3 sheets of paper under the categories of get to know, can wait, and leg thing. He denied trying to kill Thad Phillips, instead saying he was just trying to hang out. If Thad had sustained any injuries, well, he didn't know much about that because he had blacked out. How convenient. The police was the police also wanted to investigate Joe's connection to Chris Steiner, a 14-year-old teen who had been found drowned in the river. It was July 14th, 1994, a year before Thad had been abducted. 14-year-old Chris Steiner decided to go to bed early that night because he was starting a new job in the morning. His parents checked on him around 10 p.m. and he was soundly asleep in bed. But when they went to wake him up in the following morning at around 6:15 a.m., he wasn't in his room. Unlike in Thad's case, there was some evidence of foul play in Chris's disappearance. The screen window located in the ground floor bedroom had been slashed. This was Chris's older brother's room, but he wasn't home that night. It looked like someone had slashed the screen and climbed in. There were also muddy footprints found outside of the window and then inside the home. The ground floor patio doors were also discovered unlocked, but Chris's parents were sure they had locked them before bed. Because Chris was an young teen boy, the initial assumption again was that he had snuck out to go to a party or hang out with his friends, especially because it was July 4th weekend and there were many celebrations happening. The police thought he could have been another teen runaway, but Chris's parents knew that it wasn't true. He had just gotten this time a great part-time job he was excited to be starting next day. 6 days after he went missing, there would be a body found in the Wisconsin River. 6 days after he went missing, there would be a body found in the Wisconsin River, draped over a tree. The body was bloated from being in the water so long and badly decomposed. However, dental records confirmed that it was the body of teenager Chris Steiner. What's really weird, to me at least, is that when an autopsy was conducted, they didn't find any traumatic injuries on his body. His cause of death was listed as drowning. While the police believed there may have been foul play involved, his manner of death was listed as undetermined. Because of this, there wasn't any clear indication he was murdered, so there wasn't an active investigation into finding the perpetrator. His parents felt like someone had killed their son. There wasn't any other reason he would be found drowned in the river like that. When they asked around town for any information, one name kept coming up, Joe Clark. But Joe's mother swore up and down that her son was home with her at that time, without any actual evidence to connect Joe to Chris's death. They couldn't move forward. However, with this new information from Thad Phillips, the police asked Chris Steiner's parents for permission to exhume his body and they agreed. They performed a second autopsy and this time it was revealed that Chris's legs and ankles had been broken and shattered, very similar to the injuries that Thad had sustained. This is absolutely wild to me. Isn't it shocking that they didn't find these injuries during the first autopsy? It's like they didn't even try to find the cause of his death. He was found in the river, water in his lungs, boom, a drowning. End of the story. If they would have done a thorough examination and found these legs injuries the first time, they may have been able to save Thad Phillips from the torture he endured. In connection to Thad, Joe Clark was charged with attempted first-degree intentional homicide, causing great bodily harm to a child, mayhem, intent to disable or disfigure, causing mental harm to a child, and child enticement. Joe pleaded no contest and not guilty due to mental disease. In court, his defense team painted him as a victim in his own right. He had been adopted as a child, but his biological mother abused drugs while she was pregnant with him. He also claimed to have suffered from a serious head injury sustained during a bike crash just the year prior. And we do know that the studies show head injuries are more prevalent in serial killer. And we do know that the studies show that head injuries are more prevalent in serial killer, which is what Joe would have been if Thad's would have died. It may be a reason, but certainly not an excuse. Disgustingly enough, Joe Clark's adoptive mother provided yet another false alibi for him, saying that she was home that night when they went to bed and if he would have snuck out at any time, she would have heard him. Well, I doubt that because he was able to abduct and hold hostage a teen boy for over 40 hours, torturing him beyond belief, and she didn't have a clue. Joe Clark was found guilty and sentenced to 100 years of prison, so he would die behind bars. Although it may seem redundant, the prosecution wanted to continue with prosecuting Joe Clark with the murder of Chris Steiner. His parents deserved justice for their son too. Thad Phillips was going to testify in the trial when something awful happened to him. Just before the trial was scheduled to begin, 15 years old Michael Hughes, who was friends with Joe Clark and lived next door to him, shot him with a hunting rifle. As if he had not endured enough, the bullet hit Thad in the rear left shoulder. It traveled up his neck and came out near his ear. He was badly injured, hospitalized for days, but luckily enough to survive another attempt on his life. Thad was able to recover and testify in the trial against Joe Clark, where he was charged with first-degree homicide, mayhem, and causing great bodily harm to a child. He pleaded not guilty but was convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for 60 years. He has maintained his innocence and attempted to appeal his convictions, but has been denied each time. For what he endured, Thad Phillips was awarded $21 million in a civil suit, but unfortunately he hasn't seen a penny of it. To this day, he lives with pain and walks with a limp. Joe Clark claimed he had two other victims prior to abducting Thad Phillips, one identified as Chris Steiner. To this day, the other victim has never been identified, but it's pretty clear that if Thad had not found the strength to get away, being the lone survivor of the bone breaker killer, there would have likely been more victims, and for that, he is a badass and a hero. He has also survived two attempts on his life, so the universe clearly has big plans for him. I wish him nothing but the best.